The boardroom was absolutely silent except for the scratching of expensive fountain pens against thick parchment. 32 signatures stood between our technology firm and a monumental $750 million contract. I am Michael Vance, a 54-year-old vice president of infrastructure operations. For nearly 10 years, I had poured my heart and soul into building the server architecture that kept this company running flawlessly. I wore a tailored gray suit that day, sitting near the back of the room, observing the executives who took credit for the systems my team maintained. The air in the room was thick with tension and the smell of premium leather portfolios. Elliot Harper, our new chief executive officer, sat at the head of the mahogany table. Elliot was a man who valued spectacle over substance. He had joined our firm 15 months prior, brought in by a naive board of directors who thought we needed a visionary to scale the enterprise. Instead, we got a corporate politician who spent his days optimizing his public profile while ignoring the gritty reality of operational stability. Next to him sat Preston Cole, his hand-picked chief operating officer, a yes-man who nodded along to every one of Elliot's buzzword-filled speeches. We were moments away from signing the largest deal in the history of our industry, a comprehensive digital infrastructure partnership with a global logistics giant. The client's chief executive, Diane Keller, a sharp-eyed woman in her late 50s, was reviewing the final annexes. That was when Elliot stood up, clearing his throat loudly to ensure all eyes were on him. "Before we finalize this historic partnership," Elliot announced, his voice echoing in the cavernous room, "I want to demonstrate our commitment to lean, agile operations." He turned his gaze directly toward me. His smile was predatory, entirely devoid of warmth. "Michael, your services are no longer required at this firm. You and your department have been dead weight for the past 6 months. We need dynamic talent to execute a contract of this magnitude, not aging relics of a bygone era. Security will escort you out immediately." A collective gasp rippled through the room. The sheer audacity of terminating a senior executive in the middle of a $750 million signing was staggering. Diane Keller paused, her pen hovering above the signature line, her expression turning into a mask of intense scrutiny. Preston Cole smirked, clearly enjoying the theatrical display of power. 2 security guards, men I had personally helped configure access badges for just a week prior, stepped into the room looking profoundly uncomfortable. Every instinct in my body urged me to shout, to defend my decade of flawless service, to expose Elliot's staggering incompetence right then and there. But I did not panic. I did not raise my voice. I simply smiled. It was a genuine, serene smile, because I knew something that Elliot Harper had completely overlooked in his rush to secure his legacy. I knew that his grand gesture was actually a catastrophic breach of fiduciary duty. He had just severed the company's legal access to the very servers that powered the entire $750 million contract. I stood up smoothly, buttoned my suit jacket, and looked Elliot dead in the eyes. "I recommend you review the original infrastructure lease agreements." "Elliot," I said, keeping my tone perfectly conversational. "Specifically, the clauses regarding termination without cause." Elliot scoffed, waving his hand dismissively. "We have lawyers for that, Michael. Your obsolete hardware is company property now." I shook my head slowly, feeling a profound sense of peace. "No, Elliot, it is not, and you will realize that in exactly 48 hours. I turned and walked out of the room, the security guards trailing awkwardly behind me. To understand how we arrived at this spectacular moment of corporate self-destruction, you have to look back 4 years. At that time, our previous chief executive, William Lang, was facing a severe financial crisis. We had just secured a massive federal contract that required military-grade encryption and an isolated server network with a guaranteed 99.99% uptime. The problem was capital. Building that infrastructure through traditional corporate procurement would have taken 18 months and cost over $9 million. Money the firm simply did not possess at the time. William was desperate. The federal contract included punitive damages that would have bankrupted the firm if we failed to deliver on schedule. That was when I proposed an unconventional solution. I offered to personally finance, build, and own the required server infrastructure through my own independent limited liability company. I would purchase the hardware, lease the data center space, and configure the security protocols myself. In return, I would lease the capacity back to our firm at absolute cost. Zero profit margin on my end, just pure operational expense for the company. It was a massive personal risk. I drained my retirement accounts, took out substantial personal loans, and worked 80-hour weeks to build the network. William brought in outside legal counsel to draft a bulletproof lease agreement. The terms were explicit and absolute. The firm had exclusive access to my infrastructure for as long as I remained employed in a senior technical capacity. If my employment was terminated without cause, a specific revocation clause would be triggered, giving me the right to sever the firm's access with just 48 hours of notice. The project was a resounding success. We delivered the federal infrastructure 3 weeks ahead of schedule. For 4 years, that system ran flawlessly, becoming the bedrock upon which the entire company expanded. As we took on more clients, we simply routed their secure data through my proprietary server network. By the time Elliot Harper took over as chief executive, nearly 75% of the company's core operations relied entirely on hardware that belonged legally and exclusively to me. But Elliot did not care about details. He cared about press releases and quarterly projections. He assumed that because the servers were in the building and my team managed them, they belonged to the firm. It was a breathtaking failure of due diligence, a textbook example of corporate negligence that would soon form the basis of a massive legal reckoning. As I walked out to my car in the parking garage, my phone buzzed. It was a text message from Diane Keller's lead technical advisor, someone I had worked closely with during the due diligence phase of the logistics contract. "What just happened?" The message read. I replied quickly, "Check the infrastructure ownership documents in Appendix 4. You are about to lease air." I drove home, the adrenaline finally beginning to fade, replaced by a cold, calculating focus. I immediately called my attorney, Rachel Hughes, a brilliant corporate litigator who specialized in contract law and executive compensation. Rachel had reviewed the original lease agreement 4 years ago and knew exactly how airtight it was. When I explained what Elliot had done in the boardroom, she let out a sharp laugh. "He fired you publicly during the final signing?" "Yes," I replied. "He called me dead weight in front of the client." Rachel's voice turned deadly serious. "Michael, this is not just wrongful termination. This is a massive breach of fiduciary duty. As a corporate officer, Elliot has a legal obligation to act in the best interests of the company and its shareholders. By firing you without reviewing the core infrastructure contracts, he has willfully endangered the firm's primary revenue streams and its largest pending contract. We are going to trigger the revocation clause immediately." The 48-hour clock started the moment he told security to escort you out. I spent the rest of the day in my home office, monitoring the secure logs of my server network. The system was running perfectly, processing millions of transactions per second. I felt a pang of regret for the chaos that was about to unfold, knowing that innocent employees would have to deal with the fallout. But I also knew that allowing Elliot to maintain control would eventually destroy the company anyway. The arrogance he displayed was a symptom of a deeper rot, a disregard for the foundational work that actually generated value. Around 6 in the evening, my phone began ringing incessantly. First it was former colleagues, then middle managers, and finally frantic calls from the executive suite. I ignored all of them. I had instructed my team to remain calm, to back up their personal files, and to direct any technical inquiries to the legal department. The next morning, the reality of the situation began to leak into the broader corporate ecosystem. I received an email from Preston Cole, marked with high importance. "Michael," the email read, "we are having trouble locating the title deeds for the primary server clusters. We need you to provide the access codes and ownership transfers immediately as part of your exit protocol. Failure to comply will result in legal action." I forwarded the email to Rachel with a single word: engage. Rachel's response to the company's general counsel was a masterpiece of legal precision. She formally notified the firm that my limited liability company was invoking the 48-hour revocation clause due to termination without cause. She attached a copy of the original, board-approved lease agreement, highlighting the specific sections that confirmed my absolute ownership of the hardware. Furthermore, she noted that Elliot Harper's actions constituted a severe breach of fiduciary duty, potentially exposing the board of directors to massive shareholder lawsuits if the logistics contract fell through. The panic must have been instantaneous. Within 2 hours, my phone rang with a number I recognized as the direct line to the chairman of the board of directors. I let it go to voicemail. I was not going to negotiate out of fear or intimidation. I held all the cards, and I was perfectly willing to let the clock run out. As the 48-hour deadline approached, the firm's legal team attempted one last desperate maneuver. They filed for an emergency injunction, claiming that severing access to the servers would cause irreparable harm to their clients. Rachel countered brilliantly, arguing that the firm had voluntarily initiated the harm by terminating the contract owner without cause, and that forcing me to provide access would constitute illegal seizure of private property. The judge reviewed the original lease agreement and denied their injunction in less than 20 minutes. The contract was unambiguous. At exactly 2 in the afternoon, 48 hours after I was escorted out of the boardroom, I executed a secure script from my home office. It was a simple command, but its impact was catastrophic. The script revoked all access tokens for the firm's administrative accounts across my entire server network. I did not delete any data. I did not damage any files. I simply locked the doors to the house I had built and owned. The immediate effect was silence, followed by a digital explosion. The firm's internal communication systems, which were hosted on my servers, went dark. The client portals, the transaction processing engines, the secure data vaults. All of it became entirely inaccessible to the company. They were effectively blind and paralyzed. According to former colleagues who texted me from their personal phones, the executive floor descended into absolute chaos. Elliot Harper was reportedly screaming at the IT department, demanding they hack into my systems, an order they wisely refused, citing federal cybersecurity laws. The following morning, the financial news networks picked up the story. Diane Keller's logistics firm had officially pulled out of the $750 million merger, citing extreme concerns regarding operational stability and leadership competence. The firm's stock price plummeted by 22% in a matter of hours. The board of directors called an emergency meeting, and this time they did not invite Elliot. Instead, they invited Rachel and me to a neutral conference room at a prestigious downtown law firm. When we walked in, the atmosphere was heavy with defeat. The chairman of the board, a usually arrogant man named Thomas, looked exhausted. He slid a folder across the table toward us. "Michael," Thomas began, his voice devoid of its usual bluster, "we recognize that a grave error in judgment has occurred. Elliot Harper's actions were not authorized by the board, and he failed to disclose the nature of the infrastructure lease prior to his decision." Rachel leaned forward, her expression unyielding. "That is a failure of your internal governance, Thomas. My client owns the hardware. You breached the contract. The damages are already compounding daily. What is your proposal?" "We are prepared to offer a full reinstatement of your position as vice president," Thomas said, "with a 50% increase in base salary, a substantial equity grant, and a formal public apology. We will also resume the lease agreement under its original terms." I looked at Thomas, feeling a mixture of pity and resolve. "I appreciate the offer, Thomas, but the original lease was designed to help a struggling company survive. You are no longer that company, and I am no longer willing to work under the threat of arbitrary termination by incompetent executives. Here are my terms." I slid my own folder across the table. Option 1. You purchase the entire server network and all associated infrastructure outright. The price is $15 million, which represents the fair market value of the hardware, plus a penalty for breach of contract. I will provide a 90-day transition period, and then I walk away forever. Option 2. I return to the firm not as a vice president, but as the chief technology officer with full executive authority over all technical operations, and a seat on the board of directors. The infrastructure remains my property, but the firm will sign a new 10-year lease agreement at current market rates, not at cost. Furthermore, Elliot Harper and Preston Cole must be terminated immediately for cause based on their documented breach of fiduciary duty. The board members stared at the document in stunned silence. "You are asking for total control," one of them whispered. "I am offering you a path to survival," I corrected gently. "Without my infrastructure, you cannot service your existing clients. Rebuilding a comparable network from scratch will take you at least a year and cost upwards of $20 million, assuming you do not go bankrupt from client lawsuits in the meantime." Diane Keller walked away from a $750 million deal because she saw the incompetence in your leadership. If you want her back, you need to show her that competent adults are in charge. The board asked for 24 hours to deliberate. They did not need that long. By that evening, Rachel received the call. They accepted option 2 in its entirety. The financial mathematics were simply too brutally clear to ignore. Paying market rates for my infrastructure and giving me a board seat was vastly cheaper than watching the company implode. The next day, the firm released a public statement. Elliot Harper and Preston Cole had resigned to pursue other opportunities. A polite corporate fiction that fooled absolutely no one in the industry. I was officially announced as the new Chief Technology Officer. When I walked back into the building, the atmosphere was completely transformed. My team greeted me with quiet smiles of profound respect. They knew exactly what had transpired. Over the next 6 months, I completely restructured the technical operations of the company. We upgraded the systems, implemented rigorous new security protocols, and established a culture that valued substance over spectacle. I personally flew out to meet with Diane Keller. I walked her through the new governance structures and guaranteed the stability of the infrastructure because I owned it and controlled it. She appreciated the transparency and the brutal efficiency of how I had handled the situation. 3 months later, she signed a revised contract. It was not for $750 million. It was for $800 million, expanded to include our newly upgraded redundant systems. Elliot Harper's career never recovered. He tried to spin the disaster as a strategic disagreement, but the industry is small and memories are long. A chief executive who fires his most critical infrastructure owner without checking the contracts is a liability no sane board of directors will ever take on. He ended up running a tiny, struggling startup that folded less than a year later. As for me, the new lease agreement generated substantial, passive revenue for my limited liability company. I used the funds to expand my infrastructure business, eventually providing secure server architecture for 3 other major corporations. I remained at the firm as Chief Technology Officer for another 5 years before transitioning to a purely advisory role. Looking back on that day in the boardroom, the defining moment was not the anger or the humiliation of being called dead weight in front of dozens of people. The defining moment was the clarity that came from knowing exactly what my work was worth and having the legal framework to enforce that worth. In the corporate world, visibility is often confused with value. The people who make the most noise, who give the most presentations, who use the most buzzwords, they are frequently perceived as the most important. But true power lies in the foundation. It lies in the invisible systems that keep the lights on, the data flowing, and the promises kept. When you own the foundation, you do not need to raise your voice. You just need to know your rights, document your value, and wait for the perfect moment to let the contracts do the talking. That is not just revenge. That is the ultimate application of leverage. And it is a lesson that Elliot Harper, in his boundless arrogance, paid for with his entire career. Before I detail the precise mechanics of the legal trap that Elliot walked into, it is crucial to understand the exact nature of the infrastructure we are discussing. We were not simply talking about a few dozen servers sitting in a dusty closet. My limited liability company owned a state-of-the-art, geographically distributed network of enterprise-grade hardware. I had personally designed the architecture to ensure absolute redundancy. We utilized a multi-tiered security model that isolated sensitive client data across 3 separate physical locations. One data center was located in a subterranean facility in the Midwest, designed to withstand seismic events and sustained power grid failures. Another was positioned near the eastern seaboard to minimize latency for our European clients. The cooling systems alone cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, utilizing advanced liquid cooling techniques that I had spent months researching and implementing. This was not generic cloud storage rented from a major provider. This was a bespoke, proprietary fortress of digital security. Every single cable, every switch, every router was meticulously cataloged and owned by my firm. When Elliot Harper looked at me and saw dead weight, he was looking at the architect and sole proprietor of a technological marvel that processed billions of data points securely every single day. His inability to comprehend the physical reality of our digital operations was staggering. He lived in a world of abstract concepts and quarterly earnings reports, completely disconnected from the tangible machinery that generated his massive salary. This disconnect is dangerously common in modern corporate leadership. Executives are brought in to optimize revenue, and they immediately begin searching for costs to cut. They look at infrastructure as a passive expense, a utility bill to be minimized, rather than the core engine of the enterprise. They fail to understand that a 99.99% uptime guarantee is not just a marketing slogan. It is a grueling, relentless operational reality that requires constant vigilance, immense technical skill, and substantial capital investment. By owning the hardware, I had insulated myself from the arbitrary budget cuts that typically plague infrastructure departments. When previous administrations tried to reduce our maintenance budgets, I simply pointed to the lease agreement, which mandated specific operational standards that the firm was legally obligated to fund. Elliot Harper did not read that lease. He did not read the maintenance schedules. He did not read the asset ownership logs. He simply saw a line item on a spreadsheet that he wanted to eliminate to boost his short-term profitability metrics, completely oblivious to the fact that he was effectively trying to evict the landlord from the building he was renting. The concept of fiduciary duty is the bedrock of corporate governance. It is a legal obligation that requires executives and board members to act in the highest good faith and with the utmost loyalty to the corporation and its shareholders. It means they cannot make decisions based on personal ego, vindictiveness, or gross negligence. When Elliot fired me publicly, he did not just insult me, he actively compromised the operational integrity of the firm. In the eyes of the law, a chief executive officer is expected to exercise standard due diligence before making significant operational changes. Terminating the single individual who holds the legal keys to 75% of the company's operational capacity without so much as a cursory review of the relevant contracts is a textbook violation of the duty of care. Rachel, my attorney, knew exactly how to weaponize this legal doctrine. She understood that we did not need to argue about whether I was a good employee or whether my termination was fair. Fairness is subjective. Contracts are absolute. By framing Elliot's actions as a breach of fiduciary duty, Rachel shifted the entire legal burden onto the board of directors. If the board failed to rectify Elliot's catastrophic mistake, they themselves would become personally liable for the resulting financial damages. Shareholders would have the right to sue them for failing to supervise a rogue executive who was destroying shareholder value. This was the true genius of our strategy. We did not just trap Elliot, we trapped the board, forcing them to choose between their loyalty to a newly hired chief executive and their own personal financial survival. Faced with the prospect of ruinous litigation and the total collapse of the firm's operational capacity, their choice was entirely predictable. They sacrificed Elliot without a moment of hesitation. It was a brutal clinical demonstration of corporate survival instincts. The psychological impact of that 48-hour revocation period on the firm's leadership cannot be overstated. Imagine sitting in an executive suite, surrounded by glass and polished steel, completely cut off from the lifeblood of your business. Every time a sales director tried to pull up a client presentation, they received a stark access denied error. Every time the finance department tried to process an invoice, the system timed out. The frantic calls from clients began almost immediately. When a logistics company cannot track its shipments or a financial institution cannot verify its transactions, panic ensues. And because my team had strict instructions to direct all inquiries to the legal department, the executives had no one to yell at, no one to pressure into fixing the problem. They were forced to confront their own absolute powerlessness. Preston Cole, the chief operating officer who had smirked during my termination, reportedly suffered a complete breakdown in the hallway outside the boardroom, screaming at junior associates to find a workaround that did not exist. They brought in outside cybersecurity consultants, paying them exorbitant emergency rates, only to be told that the encryption protocols were unbreakable and that attempting to bypass them would trigger automatic data wiping failsafes, a feature I had specifically designed to protect against hostile intrusions. The realization that they were completely at my mercy slowly permeated the executive ranks. The arrogance that had characterized Elliot's tenure evaporated, replaced by a desperate, suffocating dread. They had built a house of cards on a foundation they did not own, and I had simply removed the foundation. The silence of those dead servers was the loudest message I could have possibly sent. It proved, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that true leverage does not come from a title on a business card. It comes from undeniable, irreplaceable competence and airtight legal documentation. My background is fundamentally different from the executives I regularly debated. I grew up in a working-class neighborhood where accountability was immediate and tangible. If my father, a master electrician, made a mistake on a job, the lights did not turn on. There were no public relations departments to spin the failure, no strategic pivots to distract from the error. You either did the work correctly or you faced the consequences. I carried that philosophy into my career in technology. I never cared about the corporate politics, the endless networking events, or the performative leadership seminars. I cared about building robust, resilient systems that performed exactly as designed under maximum stress. Over 30 years in the industry, I watched the corporate landscape shift. I watched as companies began to value charismatic visionaries over competent operators. I saw brilliant engineers passed over for promotions in favor of smooth-talking individuals who could barely explain how the internet functioned. This trend deeply disturbed me, not just because it was unfair, but because it was incredibly dangerous. When you place technically illiterate people in charge of highly complex technological enterprises, you are courting disaster. Elliot Harper was the ultimate manifestation of this dangerous trend. He possessed a master's degree in business administration from a prestigious university, a perfectly tailored wardrobe, and a vocabulary consisting entirely of empty corporate jargon. He could speak for an hour without saying anything of actual substance. He believed that leadership was simply a matter of projecting confidence and demanding results, completely ignoring the fundamental laws of physics and mathematics that governed our infrastructure. He thought he could command a server to process data faster just by setting a more aggressive quarterly goal. My revenge, if you can call it that, was simply forcing him to confront reality. Reality is entirely indifferent to your title, your salary, or your confidence. When the access tokens were revoked, reality asserted itself with brutal efficiency. When I officially returned to the firm as the chief technology officer, the shift in the corporate culture was palpable. The fear and intimidation tactics that had characterized Elliot's brief reign were gone. In their place, I instituted a culture of radical transparency and technical excellence. The first thing I did was organize an all-hands meeting for the entire technical staff. I stood at the front of the room, looking out at the faces of the engineers, developers and support specialists who had kept the firm running during the darkest days of the crisis. I did not give a motivational speech. I did not use a single buzzword. I simply explained exactly what had happened, why it had happened, and how we were going to ensure it never happened again. I told them that their work was the true engine of the company, and that from that day forward, operational stability would be prioritized above all else. I promoted several of the senior engineers who had stood by me, ensuring that technical competence was finally represented in the upper echelons of management. We completely overhauled the procurement process, requiring detailed technical reviews for any major strategic initiative. The board of directors, thoroughly chastened by their near-death experience, deferred to my judgment on almost every critical issue. They had learned the hard way that ignoring the infrastructure was a recipe for catastrophe. The firm's profitability steadily increased over the next few years, not through aggressive cost-cutting or flashy marketing campaigns, but through relentless reliability. Our clients stayed with us because our systems never went down. Our reputation in the industry transformed from a volatile, poorly managed firm into a bastion of technical stability. And through it all, my proprietary server network continued to hum quietly in the background, processing the data, generating the revenue, and serving as a permanent ironclad reminder of the true cost of arrogant leadership. Reflecting on the entire ordeal from the vantage point of my current advisory role, I often think about the nature of power in the modern corporate environment. Power is frequently misunderstood as the ability to command others, the authority to hire and fire, or the privilege of sitting at the head of a mahogany table. But that kind of power is fragile. It is entirely dependent on the consent and competence of the people below you. True power is structural. It is the ownership of the critical bottlenecks. It is the mastery of the complex systems that everyone else relies upon but refuses to understand. By building and owning the infrastructure, I had acquired structural power. I did not need to shout or posture or play political games. I simply needed to exist to maintain the systems and to ensure that my legal rights were perfectly documented.